Could people just put in the chat your affiliation so I can get a sense of what folks, who's represented in the audience? So are you undergrad, grad student? What's your disciplinary focus? Just so I have a little sense of who's in the audience, that would be great. So while you're doing that, I'll just give a little personal introduction and talk about some of the work that I'm going to present to you today. So I am at the University of Minnesota, where I work at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, which is our public policy school at the U. And most of my work over the last decade or so has been addressing clean water in one dimension or another. And I do a lot of work on state water policy as well as federal water policy. And my work is very much motivated by, I think, a pragmatic sense that we have a multitude of water quality problems. And it's important to have the best tools and the best science to address those kinds of problems. So I'm going to start today by just providing some context, and particularly we're in a year of 2020 where we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. So I want to reflect on a little bit of that context and what that means, and then jump into some of the tools of policy analysis that I work on, which is really how do we measure the benefits of clean water to people, some of the gaps and challenges and maybe critiques of that policy toolkit, really what's missing and whose values are missing from how we understand the value of clean water, and then some future directions that we need to go in order to do a better job of talking about the value of water and the role of ecosystem services. And I should say my focus here is going to be on water, but I think you'll identify connections with a whole host of other environmental and conservation policies. So this is a picture of Richard Nixon on October 18th of 1972, signing the Clean Water Act, which was a signature piece of legislation to restore, maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And there's a couple of primary tools within the Clean Water Act that are the centerpiece of that legislation. So the first are discharge standards. These would be things that if you're aware of like the NPDES program or the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, where you have to get permits in order to discharge into point sources. That would be like the pipe going into a stream. And then there's also under Section 404, a permitting process that prohibits dredging and filling of navigable waters. And those permits are typically oversaw by the Army Corps of Engineers. So when you think about the Clean Water Act, if you had an environmental history class or environmental policy class, you've probably seen this photo, which is a picture of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, which caught fire numerous times due to the industrial activities that were present, where they were sort of dumping raw chemicals, raw sewage, a lot of oil into the river, and there was railroad tracks nearby, and the river sparks from those railroad tracks would alight, cut the river on fire many times. So there's a quote from Time magazine from this era, and it describes the Cuyahoga River as chocolate brown, oily, bubbling with subsurface gases. It oozes rather than flows. Anyone who falls into the Cuyahoga does not drown. Citizens of Cleveland joke grimly, they decay. So fun fact, this picture is often credited as one of the instigations for the Clean Water Act. This is actually the fire of 1969, which most people associate with this picture, is actually that fire was never caught on film or on camera. So this is from an earlier, actually several decades earlier fire. So the Cuyahoga did catch on fire multiple times, as well as many other rivers across the US as a result of industrial pollution. So things had actually gotten quite a bit better by the time the Clean Water Act was going to be passed, and some steps had already been taken to improve water quality. But nevertheless, this remains sort of a symbol of what the waters looked like before the passage of the Clean Water Act. I was in Cleveland 2 weeks ago for a conference on the history of the Clean Water Act with a bunch of environmental lawyers. This is my selfie by the Cuyahoga River, which is now in much better shape than it was when that first photo was taken. And there's lots of signage along the river talking about how the fires on the Cuyahoga were pivotal to the passage of the Clean Water Act and all of the work that's been done to try and improve the quality of the Cuyahoga River. So that's sort of the historical context on the Clean Water Act. This is another figure from a paper that my colleague Dave Kaiser published in PNAS a couple of years ago. And it talks about how much money the US spends on improving water quality. So this is annual spending in billions, and then as a percent of GDP. So the take home here is that we spend a lot of money on water quality, nearly $5 trillion since 1970. And that's actually more than has been spent on any other environmental issue. At the same time, economists who've been investigating the values of the Clean Water Act, benefits of the Clean Water Act, have not been able to find a positive return on investment in those expenditures. So that means for every dollar, every federal dollar that we're spending on improving water quality, economists have not demonstrated that that is delivering a positive return on investment. So you typically want to see a cost benefit ratio of 1 or greater than 1. The mean benefit to cost ratio based on the results from this paper is 0.37. So that's significantly less than 1. So if that's true that this money we're spending on improving water quality is not a good investment, then it suggests that we should be shifting some of those resources maybe to other types of environmental expenditures or other types of social benefits. So this question of, are we allocating, is this an efficient, is this an effective way to spend federal dollars? Should we be spending more or should we be spending less on water quality? As well as any attempts that EPA or other agencies make in terms of expanding regulations or the jurisdiction over water will be subject to benefit cost tests. So getting this right is really important for future regulations around water quality. There's, of course, a host of ongoing issues that threaten water quality at state, local, national levels, including things like the state and local policies around infrastructure expenditures. As the big infrastructure bill was just passed, there's a lot of money in there for water-related infrastructure. States around the country are continuing to identify new waters that are impaired, as you see in this photo here from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. There's a lot of concerns about the expiring lands or lands that were formerly in Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, which is a set-aside program that keeps vulnerable cropland out of production. As crop prices are rising, more of that land is going back into production, and that leads to more chemicals that lead into our waterways. And then you can see just a host of regulations and rules that have been proposed over the last several years that threaten some jurisdictions of the Clean Water Act, as well as rolling back states' ability to regulate water quality. So we have an evolving conversation about how are we spending the money that we have? Do the benefits outweigh the costs of those expenditures? In addition to the fact that we, of course, have an ongoing threats to water quality. We don't have rivers that catch on fire, but we have a lot of what I call second order water quality problems. So those could be aquatic invasive species like the zebra mussels, non-point source pollution, primarily from agriculture. So that is not regulated under the Clean Water Act. There are threats that climate change poses to our ability to treat water. Here in Minnesota, not in Arizona, we have a lot of concerns about chloride pollution of water because of salting of roads in the wintertime. There's a big concern around PFAS compounds and their contributions to water quality problems. We have problems with sediment. We have problems related to water quality, or water quantity, I should say, as well. So many threats on the horizon. In each of these, we're going to have to figure out most of these are very expensive to address. So we need to understand if the benefits exceed the costs, and then maybe which of these problems we should focus on if we can't focus on all of them with the resources that we have. So that's sort of the context. Clean Water Act is turning 50. There's a lot of attention to, is it been a positive return on investment? Should we be doing more? Should we be doing less? And how are we going to address water quality and water policy in the future as we face numerous additional threats to water quality? So then I'm going to turn to a brief overview of some of the major tools of policy analysis, which are really how do we measure the benefits of clean water? So economists are, take their approach is trying to figure out, are the benefits exceeding the costs of these different policies? And the methods of policy analysis have particular aspects of them that make it more or less difficult to answer that question, I should say. So anyway, some of the research questions that I'm motivated by are what have we really learned about the value of clean water based on our existing tools of policy analysis? What values, and particularly whose values, are not well represented within that policy toolkit? And then what gaps need to be addressed for next generation water quality valuation? So I'm going to give a little bit of a retrospective peek at what we've used to evaluate whether or not these investments have been a good return on investment. So I have been curious about this for a while, but then the Biden administration has actually been proposed a series of reforms to the way that we think about policy analysis or regulatory review at the federal level. And so here are two executive memos issued by the Biden administration that I think pose additional challenges for those of us who are doing policy analysis. And the first is a memo on modernizing regulatory review. And I've just clipped out a couple of the key phrases from this memo. The first is to fully account for regulatory benefits that are difficult or impossible to quantify. So there's an explicit recognition that some of the benefits of water quality policies, pollution policies, conservation policies may not be able to quantify them. And that policies and procedures need to take into account the distributional consequences of regulations, including quantitative and qualitative analysis, and ensure that regulatory initiatives appropriately benefit and do not inappropriately burden disadvantaged, vulnerable, or marginalized communities. So here you have really clearly in a day one executive memo saying, look, the toolkit of policy analysis that we have, it needs some reforms, it needs to be modernized. And part of the key aspects are a greater accounting of benefits that can't be easily quantified and the distributional impacts, especially to disadvantaged, vulnerable, or marginalized communities. Over the summer, that was followed by another set of documents and agendas around the path to achieving Justice 40, which is a whole of government effort to ensure that federal agencies deliver at least 40% of the overall benefits of federal investments to disadvantaged communities. And so there's another criteria then that the Biden administration has added to our policy or regulatory toolkit that says 40% of the benefits need to go to what they call disadvantaged communities. Okay, so this I think represents the potential for a pretty big shift in how we do policy analysis, and as well as a recognition, I think, of the increasing awareness of the impacts of race and class on outcomes and how that affects disproportional benefits and burdens. So I am really interested in how do we address this question of are investments in clean water good investment from an efficiency perspective, and do it also in a way that's attentive to the mandates in these two Biden administration memos. So I think one of the key arguments that I'm making is that water quality is sort of unique in addressing these challenges. And so we have, I think one of the key differences in other types of pollution control, which are mostly focused around particulate matter or addressing climate change, is that unlike carbon, people have deep-seated emotional connections with water. People don't feel that way about units of particulate matter or carbon as a compound, but for water and the ecosystems that we recreate and swim and have cultural attachments with, there are deep-seated emotional, cultural, spiritual, and stewardship values that are associated with water, which means that there's this huge diversity of values that are material, immaterial, use, non-use, health, recreation, sense of place. There's also a diversity of different endpoints, so lakes, rivers, streams, groundwater, wetlands, and a diversity of different constituents. So that could be, you need to pay attention to nitrogen, to phosphorus, to temperature, to sediment, to these other types of contaminants, and then a big diversity of beneficiaries. So we might be talking about homeowners, we could be talking about trout anglers or recreationists, wildlife hunters. So there's a whole suite of different people whose benefits matter when we're talking about clean water. Okay, so I'm going to do just a quick preview of some of the main methods that economists use to assess the value of changes in water quality. So I'll skim over a lot of this, but first bucket is really revealed preference approaches. So this falls into two camps. Economists typically use what's called hedonics and travel cost models as two of the main ways to assess the benefits of water quality investments. So this is a snapshot of one report that represents that method. This is from Iowa State University and their lakes value program. So they had all the little red dots that you see are locations of lakes in Iowa. And they send out a survey to residents in Iowa and they ask them, which lakes did you go to? How many times did you visit that lake? In addition to asking them what their home location is and demographic information. And so from that, they can figure out how much further people travel to lakes of different quality. And from that difference, they can estimate what the value that people place on having cleaner lakes is relative to less clear lakes. So if you're willing to travel a lot further from your home to visit a clear lake, then that reveals the preference that you have for cleaner water. And then in hedonics really looks at how water quality and other environmental variables contribute to increases in property values. So if you live on a lake, like one of these lovely lakeside homes here, we know from many studies that as water quality improves, that controlling for all other factors, granite countertops and number of bedrooms, that having your house on a clear, clean lake increases your property values more than being on a less clear lake. So there's been studies that have found that, for every 1/10 of a meter change in water clarity, then you have a 1% increase in housing prices. So those are revealed preference methods of estimating the value of clean water. The other big bucket is called stated preference approaches, and that's really just where we're asking people, what are you willing to pay for clean water? Here are some examples of studies that have done that, and often what they'll do is ask a question like, say, the Minnesota River is suffering from excess phosphorus. These are the impacts of phosphorus pollution. What would you be willing to pay to support a state program that would reduce phosphorus loads by 40%? And people say, oh, well, I would be willing to pay $100 a year, $140 a year, $10 a year. So that's one way, is just sort of proposing a hypothetical referendum or a taxing policy and then asking people, what would you be willing to pay for it? Some of these other studies have shown people pictures of wetlands and asked them if you would voluntarily contribute to a fund for wetland protection that would preserve those wetland areas. And the assumption then is if you didn't contribute, that those wetlands would be developed. And then it's asking people, okay, what's the most you would be willing to contribute to protect those wetlands? So these are all different ways that economists are using to try and get people to say, oh, like, how much is this worth to you? Would you be willing to trade off such amount of money a year or more? Sometimes they'll also develop instruments like this, where they're saying, here's a blue lake, here's a green lake. Look at these lakes. One of them is much further away. One of them has a higher price of admission. Which lake would you choose given the constraints that you have on time and resources? And that's another way we're asking people to sort of state their preference and state what they'd be willing to give up for cleaner water. So those are just two. There's many other approaches that economists use, but most of the work that has been done on the value of clean water has used either those revealed preference or stated preference approaches. So there's a couple of assumptions that are embedded within these types of economic analyses. The first is that we assume that values for clean water can be expressed through a consumer choice model, which basically means that we try to simulate these market transactions. We ask people to trade something off, like give up a little bit of this and you'll get a little bit more clean water. We want to know how much you're willing to give up. That we observe those preferences at the level of the individual. And we're asking people what their next unit of water quality or next willingness to pay, unit of willingness to pay would be, which we call thinking at the margin. Economists in these models also assume that people are rational, that they have full information, that they have well-formed preferences. And the goal is really to maximize net social welfare and assuming that those who gain could be compensated and still be better off, which economists call the Calder-Hicks criterion. And I can explain more about that if people are interested. But the main point is here that there's a whole bunch of assumptions that economists make in order to understand the value of changes in environment and how they affect benefits. And when you take all of the values of water, and I mentioned there's a whole set of values that are that range from material to non-material, that stewardship and cultural values. And if you think about the kind of assumptions in economic analyses and what that does, then it's almost like a funnel, such that at the end of that toolkit, if you apply those methods, there are some implications. That the first is that not all the benefits that we know that water provides will be valued. The second is that the preferences of the rich receive more weight than the poor, and I'll give some examples of why. That the historical and social context that gives rise to the values people place on clean water and their behavior are not considered. And we're also missing a lot of other important policy criteria, many of which were addressed in the Biden administration's memo on modernizing regulatory review. Okay, so moving on to some challenges and critiques, and I think you probably already are thinking of some based on what I just showed you. So I reviewed a whole bunch of the regulatory impact analyses and environment and economic impact assessments that have been done under the Clean Water Act. And here's just a sample of them. But what you can see is that when you actually look under the hood at what benefits have been quantified when people have done economic studies of the value of the Clean Water Act, you see a lot of missing data. So I highlighted any phrases that says, oh, we didn't have data for that. We couldn't quantify it. It wasn't monetized. We didn't estimate those benefits. We were unable to quantify that. So there's just a lot of missing benefits when you look under the hood. So that's one hypothesis for why we haven't been able to show a positive return on investment in the Clean Water Act. It's just that we're not really able to measure very many of these benefits, especially using that traditional economic toolkit. The other implication is that economic analyses based on these methods will give more value to the preferences of the rich over those of the poor. So if you think about the stuff that we can monetize, like recreation and travel cost models, those often have high barriers to entry. So they, if you're gonna go recreational boating, you need to have a boat, you need a car, money for gas, or reservations for lodging, for vacation time. And so when you just look at who's recreating, you're looking at the preferences of those who have access to those resources. And then in the case of the hedonic approach, you're looking at the preferences of homeowners, and especially homeowners that live near water tend to be higher wealth households. So just a case in point, this picture right here is of a property in Minneapolis on one of our lakes called Lake of the Isles. It's about a $4 million estate. So if you were to say, okay, what happens if we increase the clarity by just a little bit in this lake, we know that would lead to an increase in price. Previous estimates have estimated that to be about a 1% change in price. So we're talking about $40,000 in benefits just to that one homeowner because of improvements in water quality. So by extension, if you sort of assume, let's find the place where we get the biggest return on investment, is it smart policy to be dumping all of our federal dollars into improving water quality that primarily benefits wealthy homeowners? And I should note that in Minneapolis, like in many places, the distribution of home ownership is highly skewed towards white families. And because of things like discriminatory housing policies and racially restrictive housing covenants, white families in Minneapolis own about 75% of their homes. About 75% of families own their homes, whereas only about 25% of Black families own homes. So even if you do the stated preference approach, you can't really get around this because willingness to pay is a function of people's ability to pay. And as long as we have deep inequalities and racial wealth gaps, will still be biasing our values based on the distribution of those resources. The other critique is that these traditional economic tools of policy analysis often miss historical context. Here are a couple of law reviews that describe some of the historical barriers to communities of color in particular, and indigenous communities, tribal communities, and their ability to get water quality improvements and just compliance with the Clean Water Act. And the differential enforcement across different areas of the Clean Water Act. So I won't go into the details of these cases, but there's been a lot of evidence that shows that even though we have this federal water policy infrastructure, it's not enforced in a consistent way across all contexts, meaning some communities have continued to bear the brunt of water pollution despite having federal policies that should ensure we all have access to those same benefits. And then the other part is that not all of the values of water are valued. So we, in the Twin Cities, this graph appears a historical image painting rendering of the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. And that's a sacred site for the Dakota people, continues to be a sacred site for the Dakota people that's deeply tied to their origin story. So the existence of the water quality in someone's sacred homeland is not something that fits well into this consumer choice model of like, oh, what are you willing to give up? What are you willing to pay to give up or improve your sacred homelands? It's just like such a ridiculous question. So it just doesn't fit in the kinds of models that we typically have use as economists. And then we're also missing some of the deep-seated cultural context that's important for certain groups about why they value certain types of water resources. So we have a lot of immigrant communities in the Twin Cities, including a lot of Hmong immigrants who have been able to, because of the existence of white bass in certain lakes, maintain cultural practices that they brought with them from Southeast Asia. And so we would never know that unless you had done more than just say like, okay, what are you willing to pay, or how far did you travel to get to these different areas? And that's also really important context in thinking where and how we should spend our water quality dollars. And then the last thing that is important is that when you actually ask the environmental justice communities, what is their top priorities? What are the issues of concern? You'll notice that water far and away is a priority issue in this survey of a bunch of Midwest environmental justice groups. Looking at 75 different groups and asking about their priority areas. So we know that paying attention to water is a key priority for environmental justice communities. And so we have to pay attention to how water intersects with equity and justice. So then in closing, I'll talk about some future directions for water valuation and some thoughts about the role of ecosystem services as a framework, whether that's helpful or not. So as I mentioned, the sort of standard economic toolkits of policy analysis focus a lot on efficiency, but equity is also an important consideration. And that's really clear if you look at the mandates in the Justice 40 and Biden administration's modernizing regulatory review memo. So we've got a long way to think about, taking that apparatus that I described and merging it with these approaches that are much more attentive to equity and distribution. So that's, I think, a big challenge and an important area of work going forward. So these are snapshots of some of the work I've done in this space. So I've been experimenting, working with a variety of different social scientists on trying to collect lots of different kinds of data about water values at different scales. And those include more traditional economic modeling, ecosystem service assessments, as well as social science surveys, focus groups, Q sorts, deliberative and participatory processes, semi-structured interviews, social media. And it's been really interesting to see how the insights from those different methods are revealing very different types of values. And if you follow those values to their conclusions, you would end up making very different decisions as a result. So I'm really interested in continuing to experiment with this more diverse, more pluralistic, more participatory set of policy analysis tools and understanding how those tools share insights into these complex environmental problems. I think that what we need to do is combine multiple disciplinary approaches to policy analysis. And that might mean including quantitative monetary metrics with spatial maps, with qualitative narratives and stories, with quantitative social science data that are really focused on who is the relevant population that this policy is intended to address, whose values and what kinds of values are at stake, and how that information will be used. And only by carefully thinking about that decision context are you ready to then select the appropriate process for eliciting and then interpreting those values for decision makers. And I think it's also important to remember that we need to start by recognizing that each of these kinds of tools, each of these methods come with varying time, resource, reliability, and accuracy requirements. And so if you're using the data to just raise awareness, you may not need the same kind of rigor as you would if you're designing an instrument like a payment scheme or a payment for ecosystem services requirement. And I love this quote because it helps keep me grounded, and the price you pay for precision is an inability to deal with real world issues. So we're always operating with incomplete information, and yet still we have to go forward and try to make the best decisions that we can. And I had a student who actually looked across the different kinds of ways in which stakeholders that we interact with use value information. And one of the take homes from that is that most respondents that we asked actually use valuation data to raise awareness. And so that implies that maybe we don't have to build sophisticated models for all of these. We need to just make sure that we're telling good stories about the value that water provides to people that allow those politicians and decision makers to really raise awareness of those values in the decisions that they make. So just some concluding thoughts. First, I think we need to quantify more benefits. We're still missing a lot, as I showed. And then we need to carefully consider who's going to decide when there's a lot of uncertainty. Should we leave it up to technocrats like economists? Should we have water quality scientists? Should it be politicians or bureaucrats that ultimately make those choices on how we should allocate our water resources among competing objectives? To remember that all methods we have are going to be biased in one way or another, but some of them are useful and probably best if we do them in combination. A reminder that to all of us, I don't know if there's any economists on the call, but economists have not cornered the market on rigor when it comes to policy analysis. There's actually a wealth of different disciplines that have, I think, a lot to offer in this space, and we haven't done enough to integrate their insights into policy analysis. And then we need to really proceed with a lot, I think, of transparency and a lot of humility as we do these kinds of studies. So in closing, I think I have been on my own sort of professional journey from a background in ecology to doing a PhD in economics to now working at a policy school. And it's also been interesting to see how the way that we think about conservation has changed over time, sort of from an initial framing of nature as a place that would be protected, more of a wilderness nature for itself model, to an ecosystem services paradigm that really focused on framing nature for people. But in some ways, I think we've actually moved beyond that model. And this idea of capturing things just in terms of their benefits to people with this ecosystem services approach, I think also might need some revisiting. So I think similar to how I described the assumptions of economic analyses sort of acting as a funnel, I think the concept of ecosystem services in some ways misses a lot as well, because it requires an ecosystem or something recognizable as nature. It requires models or tools or prioritized models and tools that rely on the integration of ecology and economics and miss out on a lot of other disciplines. And the goal, because of it, is sort of to figure out where and how nature matters to people, but that framing may not always be the right way to frame your particular context. So I think when it comes to water, we're often talking about things like pollutions and toxics, infrastructure, and lead. And those are the things that are most consequential for environmental justice groups, and a focus on ecosystem services can constrain the solution space to just the elements that nature can provide and miss opportunities to make people's lives materially better by upgrading infrastructure or reducing pollution at its source. So I'm going to end there and invite you to ask questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this informative presentation. Just a reminder to our attendees, we will now begin the Q&A portion. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A feature or the chat, and we'll do our best to get to your question in the order it was received. To get us started, Dr. Keeler, you brought up the quote that if we want complete information, we'll basically never get a chance to deal with the actual real world problem. What is one thing that we could do as individuals that could help promote more equitable policies for conservation?
I think that we've done a lot in terms of raising awareness around the importance to think about equity and justice dimensions in all kinds of policies. And I credit my students and the sort of advocates and youth leaders today that have demanded that politicians think about these things. And that wasn't the case always. And so continuing to keep the pressure up, I think, on elected officials and agencies and anyone who works in the conservation community to make sure that equity and justice and distributional impacts are going to be a key part of the way that they think about the problems and the kinds of methods that they use to analyze those trade-offs. So I think there's a lot of power that we've seen in just how people are demanding that those considerations be centered. The Biden administration would never have put out that memo without all of the pressure from the progressive movement to try and encourage those really key high-level objectives.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll start with some of the questions in the Q&A. What are some non-economic indicators or values of water quality benefits based on social and environmental dimensions that we could imagine?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are lots of ways. So one of the some of the work that we've done using interviews or semi-structured interviews allows people to describe the kinds of values that they hold for water that we're not asking them to say, like, what are you willing to trade off for more of this or less of this? And through those narratives, people often describe a lot of stewardship values, cultural values, associations. You know, I had my class a couple of weeks ago in a separate lecture. We were talking about the value of nature, and one of the student groups who was presenting had asked everyone in the class to submit a picture of what nature meant to them. And we had this whole, you know, sort of collage of all these pictures, and every single one had water in it. So it just struck me as how much many of us have a deep association with some water body in our lives. And that is something that's not easy to come across in those kind of revealed choice experiments or stated preference studies, but certainly comes across when you ask people or interview them. And it also comes across in survey work that we've done. So we've asked people to take a suite of different water values and rank them and prioritize them as how important they are. And what you see in that are a lot of references to notions of stewardship, of future generations, these more sort of biospheric or altruistic notions of water value. So it's a great question, and I do think there's a lot of methods. They're just going to be harder to monetize may be impossible to monetize, which poses challenges for integrating them into a traditional benefit cost framework.
Yeah, great answer. Thank you. Our next question is, what would you suggest as possible solutions to remedy the fact that the preferences of the rich outweigh those of the poor as related to water quality?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think if we continue to rely on methods like revealed preference approaches and hedonic analyses, we're going to continue to prioritize the preferences of the rich over the preferences of the poor. So I think we need, if we're going to keep doing those kinds of studies, we need to just be really transparent about whose values are being represented and not characterize the insights from that study as indicative of what the full population values. So that's one thing. The second part is there's a lot of conversation right now about the use of equity weights and benefit cost analysis. And so if you were looking at the preferences across a whole range of different income classes, for example, you could actually apply a weighting factor so that there wasn't this bias against people who had more income and more ability to pay. So you could sort of weight those responses proportional to people's wealth or income. And that would be a way to try and address that bias implicit in differential ability to pay. So those are, I think, a couple of tools. In general, economists have been very reluctant to try and integrate that kind of equity weighting directly into benefit cost analysis and keep that separate. So like do it, but keep it in this like separate column so that their definitions under traditional benefit cost analysis aren't affected by those equity weights, I think is probably one of the critiques. Great question.
Thank you. And then our next question is linked to your role in the BTA network and your research experience linked to policy. What proportion of your time do you estimate to invest, or would you like to invest in pure research work versus in science policy boundary spanning? Is it the role of academia or other organizations to do this boundary spanning work for applying science into decision making?
Yeah, well, that's a great and large question. I, at this point, try to not do any pure research work. I don't even know exactly what that means, though. I would say most of my work, the majority of my work is in some kind of science policy or boundary spanning area. So if I'm working on reforming benefit cost analysis, that's because I think it's important to address these holes in our toolkit of regulatory review. If I'm working with communities around water and environmental justice issues, it's because I think I want to do work that resources their questions and their priorities. So at a policy school, I found it really easy and actually to do that kind of applied work. I have an institution that really rewards and incentivizes engaged, applied, action-oriented scholarship, and I'm really grateful for that. And so I feel a responsibility to do that work because I can, and I think we've got a long way to go to have universities do a better job of kind of leveraging their resources in service to questions that matter in the real world. So what should the role of the academy or other organizations be to do this kind of work of applying science to decision making? I think we have a lot of roles. I think the university could do a lot more than it currently does, and every university operates differently. But some of the work under the Beyond the Academy network that Leah's been involved in is really trying to identify those places where we can institute reforms that will facilitate more work that's happening at that intersection, from students, from researchers, from faculty, sort of really across the board. How are we creating structures that make it easy and accepted and valued and incentivized to do that kind of engaged scholarship? So there are barriers to doing that work, but I think that there's also a lot of interest in trying to reform structures that move that forward. And it's certainly what my students want to do. So I feel motivated to try and create institutions of the future that do a better job of servicing their needs, that they want to make the world a better place. And so I think we have a responsibility to help them figure out how to do that.
I really like that response. That's often my answer when people ask why I work for the university. And I think I tell them it's because we're all trying to make the world a better place. And cliche as that sounds, that is a part of what each of us does here.
Mhm.
And then just one final question that was put in: what policies are being put into place to mediate the effects on animal agriculture on water quality? What, in your opinion, is the best solution to this problem?
Yeah, so there's always been a lot of exemptions for agriculture under the Clean Water Act. And I think a lot of concerns, especially around confined animal feeding operations or CAFOs, and the impacts that have on air and water quality, especially in surrounding communities. So there are attempts that different states have tried to regulate the permitting of those kinds of animal operations. I don't think there's going to be a lot of movement at the federal level on that, although people like Cory Booker have been big advocates at trying to enact national regulations, for example, like a CAFO ban. He's a sponsor of that bill. But I see most of the work happening at the state level. One of the problems is that there's almost like a race to the bottom with the animal agriculture, where those industries just keep moving to states with the lowest environmental regulations. And I think it's usually local concerns that have to be really elevated to state or federal levels before those industries are really held accountable to the health damage that they're causing to surrounding communities. And this is further complicated by the fact that most of these are owned by highly consolidated multinational or international companies that aren't deeply invested in or care about the neighborhoods and communities where their facilities are located. So we should do a lot more. I think it's an area where we need to spend a lot more attention, but it's going to be really challenging politically.
Are there any sort of personal choices that a person could make that could help, kind of mitigate some of those things?
I mean, you could eat less animals. I mean, that's probably the biggest thing we can all do, right? Is, thinking about the externalities of the choices we make as consumers. That's certainly a way, to vote with your fork or vote with your dollar. And then I think when we're all sort of stewards of our own little piece of land, whether it's you're a renter or you're an owner, sort of thinking about what you're doing within your own household, especially when it comes to water. Very different issues in Phoenix than they are in the Twin Cities, but the collective potential for people making different decisions about water use and water quality in their own activities can make a big difference overall. So there's always something that individuals can do when it comes to water. I feel like it's a little more empowering than the big challenge of climate change.
Yes. So how is your organization encouraging you to do some boundary spanning work? And do they evaluate this work in any way?
Yeah, so we have, as part of our tenure and promotion system, we do look at participation and engagement. Community engagement is really valued in that tenure and promotion policy. At the university overall, there's actually a separate tenure and promotion review that you can go through if you identify as a community engaged scholar, where they have it's a rubric and criteria for kind of assessing someone's community engaged scholarship. So I think those have both institutionalized a little bit this focus on engagement, and external impact is something that people care about and is baked into evaluation. I think the other pieces that institutions can do is tie grant funding to you are required to allocate some proportion of funds, or you're required to have external partners when you apply for funding. That's another way to really incentivize that kind of boundary spanning work. And then I think that doing more to add narratives to your annual reviews or your CVs that really elevate the work that you've done to try and have an impact outside of your traditional disciplinary scholarship. And so we've been encouraging people to do that as part of their annual review process, to include narratives or even include narratives from their partners that help articulate the impact and efforts they've placed on translating their work into action.
Awesome, great responses. Thank you again, Dr. Keeler, for your presentation, and thank you to our attendees for joining us. Please be on the lookout for a summer speaker series that will feature several ASU professors in a lightning round of talks. But thank you all for being here today, and thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you. Take care.